The moment you go silent, you do not just disappear, you remove their oxygen. And what happens next is not random. It is a predictable psychological breakdown. There are 7 stages every time this happens. Most people think silence is passive, weak, or avoidant. It is not. Silence is pressure. When you stop reacting, you force the other person to face something they have been running from their entire life. They must face the loss of control. For a person with these traits, control is not just a preference. It is survival. So when you go silent, you do not just end communication. You start a chain reaction. Stage 1 begins the exact moment your silence breaks their expectation of access. What looks calm on the surface is actually a sharp psychological disruption underneath. They build their interactions on predictable patterns. When they say something, you respond. When they withdraw, you chase. When they provoke, you react. These patterns are not accidental. They are how they maintain a sense of control over people and situations. So when you suddenly stop responding, you do not just go quiet. You interrupt a system they rely on to feel stable. In this phase, their mind starts scanning for answers. They replay your last conversation, your tone, your words, and even small details that did not seem important at the time. This is not self-reflection in a healthy sense. It is analysis driven by control rather than understanding. They are not asking themselves if they hurt you. Instead, they are wondering why you are no longer behaving the way they expect. More importantly, they want to figure out how to regain influence over the situation. What makes this stage powerful is uncertainty. They are highly uncomfortable in situations they cannot predict. Your silence creates a gap where their usual assumptions stop working. They do not know if you are upset, if you have moved on, or if you are ignoring them intentionally. That lack of clarity creates internal tension. The longer the silence continues, the more that tension builds because they are used to quick emotional feedback, not absence. At this point, they have not yet shifted into anger or reaction. Instead, they are mentally circling the situation, trying to piece it together without showing vulnerability. They may appear unaffected externally, even acting distracted or normal, but internally, there is a growing need to resolve the disruption. This is the moment where their control begins to slip. It does not happen because of confrontation, but because of absence. That absence forces them into a position they are not equipped to handle, where they are no longer setting the pace or direction of the interaction. Stage 2 unfolds as a protective reaction to the discomfort created in the first phase. Instead of moving toward clarity, they move deeper into distortion. Denial is not just refusing to accept reality. It is an active rewriting of it. Your silence has already disrupted their sense of control. Accepting that disruption would mean admitting they are not as influential or important in your world as they believed. That realization threatens their identity, so the mind immediately builds a safer narrative. They begin telling themselves that nothing has really changed. They think you are just busy, distracted, emotional, or going through something temporary. In their internal script, your silence is not a decision, it is just a phase. This allows them to stay psychologically comfortable without having to confront the possibility that you are intentionally withdrawing. If your silence is intentional, it means you are acting independently of their influence, and that idea is unacceptable to them. This stage often comes with a quiet sense of confidence. They may believe you will return on your own because you always do, and that this pattern will correct itself without any effort from them. They lean on past experiences where you reacted, forgave, or re-engaged, using those memories as proof that this situation is no different. It is a form of mental anchoring where the past is used to override the present. What is important here is that they are not yet trying to reach out in a meaningful way, because in their mind there is no real problem to solve. Reaching out would mean acknowledging a shift, and denial prevents that acknowledgement. So instead, they wait, they expect. They assume the silence will break on its own. Underneath that surface confidence, however, there is still tension from the previous stage. It does not disappear, it just gets suppressed. The longer your silence continues, the harder it becomes to maintain this illusion because reality keeps pressing against the story they have created. Eventually, that pressure forces movement into the next phase, where they can no longer rely on assumption alone. Stage 3 is where denial starts to crack and behavior replaces assumption. Up to this point, they have been managing the situation internally, telling themselves a story that keeps their sense of control intact. Silence that continues forces action. This is not about missing you or wanting connection in a genuine sense. It is about verification. They need data, and the only way to get it is to test whether you are still within reach. The first contact is rarely direct or emotionally honest. It is calculated to feel casual and almost accidental. It might be a simple message, a neutral question, or something that does not expose vulnerability. This allows them to probe without risking their ego. If you respond even minimally, it confirms that the connection is still active and that the control loop has not been fully broken. In their mind, your response is not just communication, it is permission. If that first attempt does not get a response, the strategy begins to shift. They may adjust their tone, timing, or approach. Sometimes it becomes slightly more personal, and other times it becomes more indirect. They might reference a shared memory, bring up something practical, or even create a small reason to engage. Every move is designed to trigger a reaction without appearing desperate, because desperation would mean losing status. Maintaining that image is critical to them. What makes this stage important is that it reveals their dependence on feedback. They are not comfortable operating without a signal from you. Your silence forces them into uncertainty, and testing becomes their way of trying to collapse that uncertainty back into something predictable. It is a controlled attempt to pull you back into the pattern where they feel secure. At the same time, frustration begins to build beneath the surface. Each ignored attempt adds pressure because it challenges their expectation of influence. They start to realize that this might not resolve on its own. But instead of accepting that loss of control, they push a little harder, adjusting tactics and increasing effort, all while trying to maintain the appearance that they are unaffected and fully in control of the situation. Stage 4 begins when their attempts to re-establish contact fail to produce the expected response. At this point, the emotional tone shifts from controlled curiosity to irritation. Up to this point, they have been operating under the assumption that a small push would restore the dynamic, and that you would eventually respond and fall back into the familiar pattern. When that does not happen, the situation stops feeling like a delay and starts feeling like resistance. Resistance is something they take personally. This irritation is not always loud or obvious at first. It often shows up as subtle changes in communication. Their messages may carry a sharper edge, a hint of sarcasm, or a passive-aggressive undertone. What was once neutral becomes slightly provocative. This is intentional. They are trying to trigger an emotional reaction because emotion is easier to control than silence. Even a negative response gives them something to work with, something they can redirect, manipulate, or escalate. Internally, the frustration is growing because your silence is no longer just confusing. It is challenging their self-image. They see themselves as someone who can influence outcomes and someone who can pull people back in with the right words or timing. When those efforts fail, it creates a disconnect between how they see themselves and what is actually happening. Instead of adjusting that self-image, they externalize the problem. In their mind, the issue is not their lack of control. It is your behavior. They may begin to label your silence as disrespectful, immature, or unnecessary. This reframing allows them to justify the irritation they are feeling without confronting the deeper insecurity underneath it. By assigning fault to you, they protect their ego from the idea that they are losing influence. At the same time, their behavior becomes slightly more persistent. The gaps between messages may shorten, or the tone may become more pointed. Each attempt carries more emotional weight because the urgency is increasing. Even if they try to mask it, the situation is no longer something they expect to resolve quietly. That growing pressure pushes them toward more intense strategies as they try to break through the barrier your silence has created. Stage 5 is where restraint starts to break and intensity takes over. Their earlier attempts were measured and almost strategic, designed to restore the connection without exposing too much. Now that those attempts have failed, the approach becomes more forceful. The goal is no longer to casually reestablish contact, but to generate a reaction at any cost. Silence has stretched beyond what they can comfortably tolerate, and the pressure that has been building internally starts to spill outward. Their communication may become more frequent, sometimes rapid, and sometimes unpredictable. Messages might come in clusters, pause, and then return again with a different tone. This inconsistency is not random. It reflects a mind that is shifting between control and frustration, trying different angles to see what breaks through. One moment they may appear concerned or emotional, and the next moment they might show cold indifference or anger. The next response might sound irritated or dismissive because these shifts are deliberate attempts to find an emotional hook that pulls you right back into engagement. They may also escalate by increasing the emotional stakes, which could involve bringing up personal history, creating artificial urgency, or introducing subtle guilt to test your resolve. The underlying intention is to make silence feel deeply uncomfortable for you, pushing you into responding simply to relieve that tension. In some cases, they may even provoke conflict directly because anger is still a form of connection, and a heated response is much easier for them to manage than a complete absence. What defines this stage is the loss of subtlety, as the controlled image they maintained earlier begins to crack, and their desperate need for feedback becomes much more visible to anyone watching. Even if they try to appear completely composed, the sheer frequency and intensity of their behavior reveal the heavy urgency pushing underneath their actions. They are no longer testing quietly or playing gentle games, but are actively trying to force movement in a situation that has become entirely stagnant from their perspective. At the same time, there is a growing sense of instability beneath every single action they take, because the lack of a response removes the very structure they rely on to function. Without that predictable structure, their behavior becomes intensely reactive, and each unanswered attempt amplifies the internal pressure, pushing them further into escalation as they try desperately to regain a sense of control over something that is no longer responding to their usual methods. If you have ever felt guilty for going silent, you need to understand this deeply right now, because you are not playing games with them. You are actually breaking one completely. This brings us to stage 6, which begins when repeated escalation fails entirely, and the reality of lost control can no longer be pushed aside by any mental gymnastics. The mind then shifts heavily into protection mode, meaning that instead of trying to pull you back in with charm or urgency, they start pushing you down in their own flawed perception. This is where severe devaluation takes full hold, and it is never a calm or rational reassessment of who you truly are as a human being. It is purely a defensive reaction designed to reduce the psychological impact of not being able to reach you or influence your choices. Up until this point, all of their frantic efforts were focused purely on regaining their lost influence over your daily life. But when those efforts completely fail, continuing to see you as important becomes entirely too painful for their fragile ego. True importance implies painful loss, and absolute loss implies total powerlessness. So, to avoid feeling that humiliation, they begin to rewrite your value from the ground up. They may tell themselves repeatedly that you were never really that significant to begin with, that the connection was massively exaggerated, or that you were actually the core problem all along. This mental shift allows them to detach from you entirely without ever having to feel defeated or accountable for their own toxic actions. This deep devaluation often shows up in very subtle or indirect ways that can catch you off guard if you are not paying close attention to the patterns. If communication still somehow exists between you, their tone will likely become dismissive, cold, or even sharply critical for no apparent reason. They might actively downplay shared experiences that once meant everything, or act as if your total absence has zero effect on their daily mood. In some extreme cases, they may speak about you to mutual acquaintances in a minimizing or completely negative way, not necessarily because they believe those lies fully, but because repeating them constantly reinforces the false narrative they desperately need to maintain their sanity. What makes this particular stage so important to recognize is that it reveals a much deeper layer of hidden insecurity underneath their tough exterior. Genuine indifference never requires any explanation or grand performance, but heavy devaluation is always completely full of defensive explanations and excuses. The more they try to convince themselves and everyone else that you do not matter at all, the more it clearly indicates that your silence has actually had a massive, undeniable impact on their psyche. It is a cynical psychological trade-off where they deliberately sacrifice the positive image of you just to preserve their own fragile sense of internal stability. At the exact same time, there is still a ton of unresolved tension lingering underneath this sudden shift because devaluation does not actually remove their desperate need for control. It merely masks the overwhelming discomfort of not having it, while the absence of your response continues to hum quietly in the background like a broken engine. Even while they act outwardly as if they have totally moved on and forgotten you, the internal conflict between needing constant validation and fiercely denying its importance remains fully active, creating a very fragile and unstable sense of closure. This leads directly into stage 7, which is the exact point where all external strategies have completely failed and there is nothing left for them to control, influence, or provoke in any way. Because of this dead end, the entire messy process finally turns inward, though this is rarely a dramatic breakdown or something visible and obvious to outside observers. Instead, it is a quiet, internal collapse of the entire psychological structure they were using to hold their fragile persona together for years. Your steady silence has permanently removed the specific feedback they depended on to survive emotionally, and without that vital feedback, they are suddenly left entirely alone with their own unfiltered, chaotic thoughts. What makes this stage profoundly different is the total absence of distraction. Whereas earlier they could easily focus on messaging you, analyzing your every move, or reacting to your boundaries. Now there is simply no response left to work with, no subtle signal to interpret, and no movement to chase down, creating a vast emptiness that forces unwanted self-awareness. The entire identity they project to the world relies heavily on external validation, on simply being seen, responded to, and emotionally engaged with by anyone willing to play along. When that constant supply disappears, even temporarily, it brutally exposes just how much of their daily stability was built entirely on manipulating other people rather than developing anything healthy within themselves. Internally, this terrifying realization can feel like a complete loss of grounding, causing them to cycle endlessly through racing thoughts as they try to make sense of what just happened. Without a clear and comforting answer to cling to, those anxious thoughts do not resolve peacefully, but instead loop continuously in a frustrating mental prison. Burning questions about control, personal importance, and basic relevance begin to surface to the surface of their mind, even if they refuse to consciously acknowledge them out loud. This is precisely where their psychological discomfort deepens dramatically because there is no longer a simple or familiar way to redirect that toxic energy outward.